Okay, I think we're approaching our very last session of the conference, an exciting time. One of the things that we've undertaken to do with these conferences that are focused almost entirely on quality teaching and quality teaching rounds is to bring in speakers who can talk to things that are connected but slightly different and help to inform and enrich our learning. Last year we had Professor Nicole Mockler talk about her really important analysis of how the media writes about teachers and teaching in Australia. And we had Professor Helen Watt talk about her work on teacher motivation. This year, we're delighted to be able to bring to you not only Nathan Towney this morning, but Emeritus Professor Dylan Wiliam, who is one of the world's leading authorities, possibly the leading authority, I'd like to say, on assessment. For those of you who are sort of connected to the academic world, I Googled Dylan on Google Scholar this morning to discover that he has an H index of 58, which is enormous. No, 66.
66,
and
yes.
has been cited more than 58,000 times. And I did some nerdy calculation that I think means that in 2021 he was cited 12 times every day. That means other academics are publishing papers where they cite his work. So it's an absolute pleasure to have someone of this stature with us in the room today. Just a little bit of a CV, I won't go into much detail, but Dylan got his first degree in physics and maths and taught mainly in inner city schools. He's also done all kinds of other really big and important jobs, including being Dean of a School of Education. He was Senior Director of the Educational Testing Service in the United States for several years. But for about the last 15 or so years, Dylan has really dedicated his academic work to this area of formative assessment and is working now all over the world with teachers in the development of formative assessment practices. So I'm really excited to learn from him, not only this afternoon, but I'm coming to listen all day tomorrow and learn as well. But please welcome Dylan Wiliam. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Oh. That was a good start, yes. We were saying it's very precarious, yes. So we'll see how that goes. I think you can try switching again now. Oh no, the cable came undone. Okay. You can try it now. Great. Okay. Thank you. So I sometimes joke that I left university life 12 years ago to focus on teaching and research. I found that you couldn't actually do much of the kind of research that I wanted to do, which is working with teachers, if you stayed in the university, because they wanted you to produce research publications that hardly anybody reads. So I left university life to focus on teaching and research. In today's talk, I want to actually tell you why I think formative assessment should be a priority for every teacher and every school. And to do that, I want to give you 5 arguments for formative assessment. They're listed there. I'm not going to go through that. You'll come across them as I go through the talk. And then I want to conclude by talking about how we might take this to scale, that we need to think about the strategies and techniques of formative assessment, and I'll conclude by sharing with you what we've learned over the last 15 years of how to support teachers in putting this into practice in their own classrooms. You will actually get all the slides, so at the end of today, I'll send the slides through to Jenny, and you will be able to use them all. They're available to you under a Creative Commons license, so you can use them in your own schools for whatever purpose you find helpful, provided you tell people where you got them from and don't try to sell them on eBay. I want to begin with a cross-cultural argument. So if you remember, Australia participates in this thing called PISA, this test that rolls around every 3 years. And I'm going to focus on the results from 2015, published in 2016, where they focused on science. And they looked at what are the features of science classrooms where students have high achievement. And so there are 5 things that I've chosen, and I'd like you to think about which one of those do you think is the most strongly associated with high achievement in science? Which of those is the strongest correlate of high achievement in science? And to give you a bit of a chance to reflect on this, I'm going to invite you in a minute to to turn and talk to a neighbor, or if you're very antisocial yourself, and to bring the group back together again, rather than shouting over you, I'll just raise my hand. And when you see me raise my hand, I'd like you to do two things. One easy, one hard. The easy one, raise your own hand. The hard one, stop talking. Okay? So just take 30 seconds now. Just turn to a neighbor. Which of these do you think is the most strongly associated with high achievement in science classrooms around the world? Thank you. So if this were a traditional classroom, I would ask you for your opinions, and the more confident amongst you would voice those opinions, and the less confident would avoid eye contact. As you're about to discover, this is not a traditional classroom. In a minute, I'm going to ask you to vote your choice using a digital voting system. I'm going to ask you to hold up 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 digits, according to whether you think the answer is A, B, C, D, or E. But before I ask you to vote, can I just point out, I can tell if you haven't voted. In my classroom, it's far better to be confidently incorrect than it is to fail to vote, and I'm looking at you up there as well, because if you don't vote, I will ask you why you haven't voted. I couldn't do that with an electronic voting system. I wouldn't be able to check that everybody's voted when you're holding up a choice. So, 1 for A, 2 for B, 3 for C, 4 for D, 5 for E. Please vote now. Thank you, hands down. Okay, so the good news is that most of you are wrong. Which is good news, because if you knew all this already, I've just wasted the last 3 minutes of your life. The good news is that most of you are going to learn something because you got it wrong. And interestingly, the more confident you were right, you were that you were right, the longer and more permanently you will remember the correct answer. This is now known as the hypercorrection effect. And I'm not going to tell you the answer yet. Because actually, you want to know what the answer to this question is, don't you? You care more about the answer to this question than you imagined possible 10 minutes ago. I've made you care about something you didn't care about when you walked into this room, simply by making sure you have, as the Americans say, got skin in the game. You want to know because you've made a choice, and you want to know whether you were right or not. And I'm going to stretch it out even more. I'm going to tell you, see, I did not know what I was going to say to this group until I saw how you voted. Because if you'd all given me the correct answer, I would have said something different. This is a pedagogy of responsiveness. And I didn't base that decision on just the views of the more confident and articulate of you. I got information from everybody. It's a pedagogy of engagement. And this is what formative assessment is all about. It's a pedagogy of engagement, getting information from every member of the group rather than just the usual suspects, and using that information to adjust your teaching to better meet the learning needs of all the learners in the classroom. They all belong. That's what equity is about, making your decisions on the basis of everybody's learning needs rather than just the few who are confident. And I think I probably have stretched this out long enough. The top 3 factors, well, the top one is obvious, and I didn't put it in the list. It's the student's socioeconomic profile. The schools is not that important. Of the ones in the list, the top one is actually teacher-directed instruction. Inquiry-based or inquiry-based instruction was actually the second most negative. Now, it doesn't mean it's a causal effect. It could be that teachers are choosing to use more inquiry-based instruction when students are poorly motivated, so I'm not going to claim a causal effect there, but here's the important takeaway. The second biggest factor in high achievement in science classrooms around the world, in the 75 countries that participated in PISA, was the extent to which teachers adapted their teaching in the light of evidence from their students. What I call formative assessment, what they call the index of adaptive instruction. The idea is that we change our teaching when we discover something about what our students, what sense they're making of what we're talking about. So that's the cross-cultural comparison, the argument. The intuitive argument is even simpler. It comes from an uncomfortable fact about the world and an important principle about learning. The principle about learning comes from the work of David Ausubel, who over 50 years ago now said, if I had to reduce all of educational psychology to just one principle, I would say this: the most important single factor influencing learning is what the learner already knows. Ascertain this and teach accordingly. But we don't do that. We say silly things to our children like, you should know this, you're in year 8. Well, in Australia, how do you get into year 8? Start in year 7 and have a birthday. That's basically, have you had a birthday? Good, on you go. Our students are where they are. Wishing they were somewhere else doesn't help. Why is it so hard? Because the uncomfortable fact about the world. Our students do not learn what we teach. We teach these wonderful lessons, we take in the work, and we wonder what planet they were on when we were teaching this stuff. How could you possibly believe that's what I said? Our daily experience as teachers is failure. We fail all the time because we hope for so much. Teachers are the most ridiculously optimistic people on the planet. You've taught this lesson so far 15 times in your career and never have more than half the students got it, but this time is going to be different. This time you are going to nail it. This time every child is going to get when "it's" has an apostrophe. We fail because we want every child to succeed. And the important point is we bounce back and try something else. This is really important because otherwise you just get very depressed. And I think we've been misapplying Carol Dweck's work on growth mindset because we've applied it exclusively to students. And it's time we also applied it to teachers. Because if you don't think you can be a better teacher next month than you were this month, then you'll be that cynical, twisted old teacher who says, what can you expect from these kinds of kids? Kids from that part of town, kids with those parents. That teacher doesn't think they can improve, so they blame the students. The teacher who thinks they can get it better says, what else can I try? So before I go any further, there's just one point I want to clarify about what I mean by learning. The definition I like is a change in long-term memory. Now, many people dislike that definition. They say, it's more than memorization. Yes, it is. In psychology, long-term memory is the term we use to describe everything that you don't need to relearn how to do. If you can ride a bicycle, it's in long-term memory. If you can recognize your children, it's in long-term memory. The point that Paul Kirshner and his colleagues are making here is, if we teach students something they can do today, but they can't do it in 2 weeks' time, we shouldn't call that learning. We should be going for the long term. We as teachers should be in the memory business. It's not about covering the curriculum, it's about helping our children learn what we're teaching them. And it's really difficult, because every teacher has had the experience of teaching a lesson that goes really well, and you check this understanding at the end of the lesson, every kid can do this, and 3 weeks later, it's as if the men in black have come along with their neuralizers and erased every trace of that lesson from those students' brains. They will tell you, you didn't teach us this. Yes, I did. I've got it on video. The point is, psychologists distinguish between performance, which is how well the students complete the task, and learning, which is the change in long-term capability that result. And we need to be focusing on the long term, which presents a real problem for formative assessment because you need to make decisions right now. The fact that they can do it at the end of today's lesson does not guarantee they can do it in 3 weeks' time, but, and this is the foundational idea, if they can't do it at the end of today's lesson, it's highly unlikely they'll be able to do it in 6 weeks' time. You'll make better decisions about what to do in your classroom if you have better evidence about what's going on in your students' heads. A pedagogy of engagement and a pedagogy of responsiveness. Another way to think about it, there's a strange paradox at the heart of teaching. Every teacher I've ever met knows that no lesson plan survives the first contact with children. But we plan our lessons as if they're going to go perfectly. So I'm saying, let's design our lessons with checkpoints in them. Let's get to a certain point and say, okay, I'm going to check on everybody's understanding, and if they are, with me, I'll move on. If not, I'll do something else. But this is planned as part of the lesson, rather than being a scramble to figure out what to do when you suddenly discover the lesson isn't going the way you thought it would. We build plan B into plan A. The functional argument. People disagree about what formative assessment means. Some people think about testing students every 6 to 10 weeks. I'm okay with that, because it's useful to identify students who are not making progress. So I'm looking for an inclusive definition. And I talk about long cycle, medium cycle, and short cycle formative assessment, defined on the span, the length of the cycle, and what gets formed by the formative assessment. So testing students every 6 to 10 weeks is a good thing to do. It's a disaster if you get to the end of year 5 and discover that the children aren't ready for year 6 work. Any well-run organization should be monitoring progress towards its goals, because you can monitor student progress and you can make sure your curriculum is well aligned to your goals. We can also use formative assessment within and between teaching units. I think one of the most important things we can do is to have no surprises in our grading. Students often say, "She gave me a C," which means that they don't understand what they needed to do to get a B. I got a C because I didn't do what I needed to do to get a B is a different conversation. It's what Richard Stiggins calls student-involved assessment. The idea that assessment becomes something that's done with students rather than to them. But the greatest impact comes when formative assessment is done minute by minute and day by day, with and between lessons. Not so much every 6 to 10 weeks, more like every 6 to 10 minutes. Because then you get this pedagogy of engagement and a pedagogy of responsiveness. Here's an example of a kindergarten class. The teacher has written a sentence on the board which may contain some grammatical errors, and she's asking the children, "Is this correct?" You can see a little boy here, far more interested in me than everything else. I just could not get him to turn around. There's a couple of boys here holding up green discs. They think it's correct, but most of the children think it's incorrect. Okay, you think it's incorrect? Tell me what's wrong. We'll fix it. We'll vote again. The teacher is getting a constant stream of evidence from the children, so she's able to meet all her children's learning needs, not just those who are willing to share. This is this pedagogy of engagement and responsiveness that I mentioned, and it works right across the entire educational range. So I saw as a chemistry teacher post up a chemical equation that was without unbalanced, and asked the students to contribute changes in the compounds to make it balance. And after a little while, nobody wanted to change anything, and the teacher then said, "Is that now correct?" And every student had to vote yes or no. No place to hide. The teacher is getting evidence about who gets it and who doesn't. To actually make it useful in the classroom, we have to go a bit deeper. So I've thought about this for quite a while, and I think there are basically 3 processes: where the student is, where they're going, how to get there. But we also need to think about the role of the teacher, the learner themselves, and their peers. You may have heard some people talking about assessment for learning, and then they added this thing called assessment as learning. And the reason that the term assessment as learning was invented was because the definition of assessment for learning focused on the role of the teacher, and they'd realized they'd forgotten about the role of the students. For us, formative assessment has always been inclusive of the student perspective, because I don't think you can change what teachers do in classrooms unless you also change what students do in classrooms. So for example, if you try doing peer assessment, many students will say, "Well, that's the teacher's job." No, it's actually not. It's everybody's job. So the idea is this inclusive perspective gives us 5 strategies: clarifying, sharing, and understanding learning intentions, being clear about where you're going. Now, people say you should make the children write down the learning intentions or the success criteria. And I don't know of any evidence that suggests that's important. I think it's important that the teacher knows. I mean, I don't want a teacher walking into a classroom, "Oh, look, some children. What shall I do with them?" You need to be clear about what the learning intentions are, but whether you share them with your students, and if so, at what point in the lesson, is a different matter. I saw a wonderful chemistry lesson where the teacher started off by saying, actually a science lesson, "Why does it take longer to cook potatoes at 220 degrees Celsius in an oven than it does at 100 degrees Celsius in a pan of boiling water?" What a great question. Now, the teacher had a clear learning intention in mind, and he shared it with the students 20 minutes into the lesson. He was clear about the learning intention, but he judged that the best way to start the lesson was not with a learning intention, but by getting the students interested and intrigued and thinking about the right stuff and activating prior knowledge. So don't let anybody tell you that the research says we must start with a learning intention. I don't know of any research that says that's true. You need to be clear about it, but whether you share it with the students, that's your professional judgment. The second strategy we call eliciting evidence, because it's not just questioning. It's all the ways we get evidence. PE teachers don't ask many questions, they observe. English teachers walk up and down the aisles when children are writing, peering over their shoulders, doing that funny thing called noticing. So the point is, it's all the ways we get evidence. And then providing feedback that moves learners forward. The big idea here is we're constantly getting evidence about where students are in their learning so that we can adjust our teaching, and then we're giving that feedback. We're getting evidence, and we're actually using that to feed back to the students. But here's the really important point. When we think about feedback, we often fixate on the last four letters, B-A-C-K. People think that feedback should be backward-looking, the view through the rear-view mirror, rather than the view through the windscreen. Or as Doug Reeves points out, it's like the difference between getting a medical and a post-mortem. And too many of our students get post-mortems. Even when they do comments rather than grades. This would have been a better piece of work had you done the following things. But you didn't, so it isn't. And here's where we go wrong with feedback. We think the purpose of feedback is to improve the work. It's not. It's to improve the learner. The purpose of feedback is to help the learner do a better job at some point in the future on a similar task. The last two strategies underscore the fact that, as Richard Stiggins has pointed out, the most important decisions taken in classrooms are not taken by teachers, they're taken by learners. Doesn't matter how good your feedback is, if your students have no desire to learn, you're wasting your time. So we have to activate students as learning resources for one another and as owners of their own learning. And in many ways, this last strategy is the most important. Let me illustrate. I'm often asked to observe teachers teach a lesson. If I watch a teacher teach a lesson, I can guarantee the first question that teacher will ask me is, how did I do? Or in Australia, how did I go? And I say, how do you think you did? I'm not doing that to avoid the question. I'm doing that because if that teacher can give me a good answer about how that lesson could be better, my work here is done. That teacher knows what she needs to do to improve. She is well on the way to becoming, in the psychological jargon, a self-regulating learner. And this is the crucial point about feedback. Good feedback works towards its own redundancy. Good feedback makes future feedback less necessary by equipping the learner with the skills of monitoring their own progress. And that's why this last strategy, activating students as owners of their own learning, is, in my view, the most important. All the others lead there. Because if we actually empower our students to be more effective as managers of their own learning, then they can carry on learning when we're not around. So they all feed towards that goal, but ultimately, what psychologists call self-regulating learners is the goal. Some people prefer the phrase adaptive teaching or responsive teaching. That's been quite popular in some parts of Australia. The point I make is that if you're talking about responsive teaching, I think you're placing too much weight on the role of the teacher. We also have to think about the learner's role. So some people talk about responsive teaching rather than formative assessment, and I'm saying, well, you've got about 40% of it. But the learner's role is crucial, and the other thing this diagram highlights is formative assessment does not tell you what to teach. It does not tell you how to teach. It is just a consequence of the fact that what students learn is unpredictable from what we teach. Assessment is the bridge between teaching and learning. It is only by assessing we can figure out whether what we just did had the intended effect. If students learned what we taught, we would never need to assess. We could just write down what we taught, secure in the knowledge that students had learned it. But they haven't necessarily learned it. We need to find out to be more effective. The empirical argument, you can look at loads of research studies on the effects of feedback. I mean, the interesting thing here, people often ask me, well, does this work in special education? The very first review of research on formative assessment was done by Lynn and Douglas Fuchs in the context of special education. That's where it all started. Why? Because there's far more of a tradition of treating students as individuals in special education. In mainstream education, we treat them as a batch. They are year 7. They're all identical. We'll teach them all the same. We know that doesn't work in special ed, which is why they were forced to confront the differences between students, and that's why all this work started in special education. I think in a very real sense, you can think of the work I'm doing on formative assessment as an attempt to bring to mainstream education things that have been standard practice in special education for years. Start from where the learner is, rather than where you'd like them to be. The study by Elshoot Moore reviewed Dutch language literature, Alana Lopez reviewed the Francophone literature, Olaf Köhler looked at research in German, Nyquist looked at college-age learners, Wiliam looked at machine learning. So basically, all these studies point in a very similar direction. But of course, the fact that these things work in laboratories doesn't necessarily mean very much. So what's really important is the direct experiments, where people have gone in and changed the way the teachers have taught. Kingston and Nash reviewed the research and found a 50 to 70% increase in student learning. A big study of 140 high schools in England found that over a 2-year period, over basically years 10 and 11, when teachers were given time to do formative assessment, their students made 25% more progress over the last 2 years of compulsory schooling in England. So we now know from some pretty well-designed experiments that when teachers are given time to do this, their students make more progress. Another issue that comes up all the time is equity. Is it fair? And so I've heard that you're actually quite worried about achievement gaps in Australia. Is that right? The answer is very simple, by the way. Just send the smart kids home on Thursday. Get rid of the gifted and talented program. That'll close the achievement gap, but not in a good way. So I think we shouldn't think about so much of an achievement gap. I think a gap between the top and the bottom is the wrong way to think about this, because you can close the gap by suppressing the top. So here's the way I prefer to think about it. Basically, here's my definition of equity. Proficiency for all, excellence for many, and all students' subgroups proportionally represented in the excellent. So whether you're indigenous or not, whether you're a boy or a girl, whether you're from a rich home or a poor home, should have no impact on your likelihood of being in the excellent. That's what a genuinely equitable system would look like. That none of these background variables have any impact on your chances. There'll be some differences between students, but they shouldn't be systematically related to any of these kinds of variables. And so the Education Endowment Foundation in England looked for interventions that could specifically close the achievement gap. And they went beyond John Hattie's work. They looked at impact on student achievement, and they chose quite a sensible metric, extra months of learning, because nobody understands effect sizes. True, nobody understands effect sizes, okay? Because they're meaningless in education. We can talk more about that in the Q&A if you're interested. They looked at the cost. Because something that gives you a small effect size at a low cost might be great. And something that gives you a huge impact might not be very good if it's very expensive. They also looked at the quality of the evidence. How secure is the evidence? And they used a system of padlocks. And so here's what they found, and I've gone through all, so in the slides here, you've got the cost, you've got the quality of the evidence, and the extra months of learning for different kinds of things. And here's all the things they looked at. I'm not going to go through them in detail. Here's the important point. Let's just look at the ones with strong evidence. The things that have strong evidence for their efficacy in reducing the range of achievement in classrooms. But some of these things, like phonics and oral language interventions, are very much age-specific. So what are the things that have strong evidence, are cost-effective, and are generic? There are 3. Metacognition, self-regulated learning, feedback, and peer tutoring. How does that relate to formative assessment? Well, what were the top 3? The first one was self-regulated learning. The second one was feedback. The third one was peer tutoring. So the 3 most effective ways of closing the achievement gap are 3 of the 5 strategies of formative assessment. What about the other 2? Well, you can't give feedback until you find out what's going wrong, so you have to get the evidence. And you don't know what evidence to collect until you know what it is you want your students to achieve, so you have to be clear about the learning intentions. So these 5 strategies turn out to be a minimum set of the most powerful interventions for raising achievement in general and for closing the achievement gap in particular. That's why I think formative assessment should be a priority for every teacher and for every school. So putting it into practice, well, I think we have to understand that this is really quite hard to do. And I think if I've had one insight into this work over the last 25 years that is probably more important than anything else, it is to realize that actually most of the professional development we've done in Australia and elsewhere has been based on the wrong model. We've assumed that teachers don't know stuff. And if we tell the teachers the stuff that they don't know, we herd them into rooms like this and have so-called experts like me tell the teachers the stuff that we assumed that they didn't know. And the idea is that then they go away and they're better teachers. We've been doing this for 30 years and it hasn't worked. Who's the slow learner here? A good example is the research on wait time. So I don't know if you know this research. I assume you've heard about this. The idea that when teachers ask questions, they ask a question, they don't wait long enough. Do you know what the average wait time is? Just indicate with a number of fingers for the number of seconds. How long do teachers wait on average after asking a question? The answer, according to one classic study by Mary Budrow, was 0.9 seconds. When I saw that, I did not believe it. Are you kidding me? But it depends what you mean by question. Teacher asks a question, student looks a bit confused, teacher realizes the question wasn't very clear, teacher immediately rephrases the question to make it clearer. Now the pupil is very confused. Is that one question or 2? And if it's 2 questions, which one of the 2 would you like me to answer? The student looks so confused, the teacher has a third go, making it even clearer. Now the student is completely confused, there's 3 questions on the table, they have no idea which one they're meant to be answering, which is why the teacher gives up and asks somebody else. All because the teacher didn't plan the question. One of the most depressing things you can do as a teacher is to record your lessons and count the number of words in your questions. It is very common to find teacher questions lasting 30, 40, even 50 words. It's amazing that anybody can remember how the question began by the time the teacher eventually shuts up. So we have to actually understand that reminding teachers of the research on wait time has no impact on teachers' wait time. In the same way that reminding smokers of the harmful effects of smoking has 0 impact on smoking behaviors, because it's not a knowledge problem, it's a habit change problem. And that's the most profound impact, the profound insight I think I've had in this work in the last 25, 30 years. We've been treating teacher professional development as a knowledge problem. They don't know stuff, and if we tell them the stuff that they don't know, they'll be better teachers. It's actually, for all but the most novice of teachers, it's a habit change problem. We need to help them get better at the things they do every day. The other point about this is often we tell teachers they're teaching all wrong, and I'm saying, no, let's start from where the teachers already are. Let's start from the things the teachers already do and help them do that in a slightly more effective way. So we developed this idea of strategies and techniques, and we use these 2 words, I hope, in a fairly precise way. So let me just illustrate. So the strategies are the 5 things I talked about earlier. Learning intentions, eliciting evidence, feedback, students as learning resources for one another and as owners of their own learning. These are always good things to do. But how you do them depends on the subject, the age of the students, the context of the school. So we say that the strategies are no-brainers, but the teachers are responsible for the choice of the techniques. So we never tell teachers which techniques to use. In one of our very first experiments, we actually lay these ideas out, and the teachers, there were 24 math teachers, joined later by 12 English teachers, they thought we were operating a perverted model of discovery learning, where we actually knew what we wanted them to do, but we weren't going to tell them so they could discover it for themselves. And after about 3 months, they realized we did not actually have the answers. What we were interested in is how they would explore these ideas for themselves. So the strategies are no-brainers. The techniques need to be chosen by the teacher because they can make it work. So, sharing learning intentions and success criteria. A good example here, from the youngest to the oldest children, is just ranking samples of student work. Which of these is good? Which of these is less good? Just talking about why. And you've probably seen that video of Austin's butterfly. That's a nice example, but you can do that at PhD level. Just the idea of which of these two is the better one? Why? Just elicit those criteria. Eliciting evidence, the whole idea of all student response systems. Getting a response from every single student, not just the usual suspects. You can work towards it using ice pop sticks, but I think the really important point, no hands up, that's actually a step towards the goal. The goal is getting information from everybody. Using those red and green discs or finger voting, the idea is you can't make good decisions without evidence from the whole group, rather than just the students who are confident. Feedback that moves learning forward. So you probably heard me talk about the fact that grades are less helpful than comments, but it's still quite hard to get the students to read the comments. So an English teacher in London, Charlotte Kerrigan, tried a new approach. This was a year 10 class. They'd done an essay on a Shakespeare play they'd read. Rather than writing her comments on the students' essays, she wrote them on strips of paper, and each group of 4 students got back their 4 essays and their 4 strips of paper, and their task was match the comments to the essays. And I thought that was a very clever way of slowing down the ego reaction, because when you pick up one of those slips, you have no idea whose comment it is. So you read it for what it says, not for what it says about you. So match the comments to the essays is a really good example of a technique that actually helps you get the students to read the comments. Students as learning resources for one another. This works very well when students are preparing for a test like NAPLAN. Students do a test under test conditions on their own. And at the end of the test time, you take in the papers, but you don't score it yourself. You put them in a drawer. Next day, each group of 4 students gets back their 4 test papers and a blank answer sheet, and their task as a group is to construct the best composite response. They compare their answers to question 1, to question 2, to question 3. Now, as a result of the work of Graham Nuttall in New Zealand, we actually know that students often say things to each other that are wrong. His estimate was that half of the stuff that kids learn in school, they learn from each other, and half of that is wrong. And we've seen lots of examples of that. So if you do use this approach, you have to make sure that you then have a plenary session. What's this table's answer to question 1? What's this table's answer to question 1? So you can make sure that students aren't misleading each other. And then students as owners of their own learning, practice testing. Now this is actually quite controversial. There's a famous joke in assessment, weighing the pig doesn't fatten it. It's true in agriculture, it's not true in psychology. Testing yourself on what you're meant to be learning is actually one of the most cost-effective ways of making learning stickier. But our students don't like being tested. So I advocate zero-stakes testing. At the end of a unit, we give the students a test that they do on their own under test conditions. When they've finished, we give them the answers. And they score their own work, and they don't even have to tell you how they did unless they want to. The value of practice testing is so great that we have to rehabilitate it. And if that means we don't have so many scores or grades to put in our mark book, so what? The value of testing is primarily for the person being tested, not the person doing the testing. So those are 5 of the ideas. We then try to put this into practice in a program that we called Embedding Formative Assessment. The idea here was that we would actually work towards a system of doing this at scale. So the design brief I gave to the team that I was working with was, we actually, I don't know what the smallest school district in Australia is. We found one in North America called Alice Lake. This is a whole school district with its own tax-raising powers, with its own conditions of service for teachers, 76 students and 6 teachers, in the middle of Nebraska. So I said, we're going to ship a box to Alice Lake, Nebraska. What's going to be in the box? Everybody says we must make sure that we support this program. That's a recipe for failure, because you can't support things remotely. So we said, look, of course it would be better if we could go and deliver this program in person, but let's design it as if we don't need to do that. Another point of approach between my work and the work of the quality teaching rounds, we think you need to focus on generic pedagogy. People say professional development for teachers must be subject specific. That's not true, and it's a recipe for limited success. Because if you train teachers in how to teach a particular topic, you'll improve the teaching of that topic, but you won't improve the teaching of any other topics. And improving teacher content knowledge seems to have almost no impact on student achievement. In one experiment, they actually gave these maths teachers in the United States training over the summer in the mathematics content they were teaching, and they got higher scores at the end of the course. 76 days later, all the extra learning had vanished, just disappeared. So the point is, we need to be looking at things that make a difference. And so that was the big idea here. Of course, these ideas have a subject-specific element. What makes a good question in history is not the same as what makes a good question in mathematics. But actually, the idea of getting responses from everybody in the group, rather than just the usual suspects, that's true for every subject. It's about being clear about what can be done generically and what has to be subject-specific. So the model, again, this is something that Jenny's talked a lot about in the past. Left to their own devices, teachers will chat forever. And so there's lots of these models going around about teachers setting their own problems. You know, what problems are we facing? I think that's wrong, because teachers don't know enough about the research to know that what kinds of changes they can make in their practice will have the biggest benefit for their students. So the idea is, let's first figure out what we want to help teachers get better at, and then, and only then, figure out how to help them get better at that. So I think this idea of formative assessment is the best starting point. That's the content. So what we want teachers to change is their use of formative assessment. We start with the evidence, and then we build in these ideas, these practical techniques that teachers can use. And then we actually have a process model that we've refined over about 15 years. And we think 5 things are important. I can't guarantee that if one of these things is missing, you're going to fail, and if they're all present, you're going to succeed. But we think there are 5 things that really maximize the chances of success. The first is choice. Every teacher gets to choose which techniques they will prioritize in their own work. This is really important, because often in schools, a teacher is teaching, and a deputy head comes in and watches them teach and tells the teacher what they're doing wrong. And that might be correct, but it might be incorrect as well. So, choice, the teachers choose. Then flexibility. Adapt them to make them fit your own classroom. Small steps, allowing each teacher to take as small a set of steps as you want. If you want to work on wait time for 6 months, that's okay with us. I've lost track of the number of times teachers have said to me, when I describe a formative assessment technique, oh yeah, I used to do that, it was good. I used to do that, it was good, but something else came along and I don't do it anymore, because they didn't make it into a habit. We have to let teachers work on a single technique until it becomes a habit. Then we make them accountable for making improvements in their practice and give them a support. And that's the big idea here, combining support and accountability into a process that we call supportive accountability, that we actually embed in this signature pedagogy. So we think that every single teacher meeting should have the same structure of activities. Some introduction, some kind of warm-up, and then the active ingredient is feedback. Each teacher knows they're going to have to report back at this meeting what they promised to do at the previous meeting. There'll be some new learning about formative assessment, a drip feed of new ideas, and then time for personal action planning. 15 minutes once a month for each teacher to decide, how will I be a better teacher next month than I was this month? Then finally, a review of the learning. And this structure, I think this is the 14th model we tried, but this is the one that seems to have worked best. These groups need leaders. People ask us, how should we train the leaders? Our advice is, don't. When people running these groups think they're experts on formative assessment, they tell other people what to do. We've seen teachers in their second year of teaching being outstanding leaders of these groups because they know they don't have the answers. Somebody joked, this is more like Alcoholics Anonymous than traditional professional development for teachers, because there are no experts here. There are just people creating an environment for like-minded people to get together. And finally, a quick word about peer observation. If Jenny's coming into my classroom, I tell her what to look for. I'm trying to improve my wait time. I give her a stopwatch. And here's the clincher. Any notes she makes in my classroom belong to me, because she's working for me. When I'm in her classroom, any notes I make belong to her, because I'm working for her. And by making the person being observed the owner of the process, this helps to distance it from the formal school appraisal systems, the performance management systems, and make it something that's genuinely owned by the teachers. So that's basically what we've learned, is that this process, just giving teachers 75 minutes once a month to work on this process without any external support, produces substantial increases in student achievement by making teaching more responsive to student needs. So I'll stop there because we've got some time for questions, but that's why I think formative assessment should be a priority for every teacher and every school.
Thanks so much, Dylan. Really insightful and really practical. And I personally hear lots of echoes of the work that we're doing on quality teaching rounds, but also some really important differences. Can I encourage people to use the Q&A section on the app? If you are not sure where it is, you just click on Dylan's presentation, click presentation, and it's there for you. But there are a few questions, and one you actually invited, which is, can you elaborate on your views on effect sizes, please?
Okay, so strictly speaking, effect sizes are only justifiable when they're unnecessary. If I wanted to compare two approaches for teaching maths, and I use the same test for both experiments, I wouldn't need effect sizes. I would just use the scores on the test. If you're going to use different tests for different experiments, you need to be sure that the two different tests you're using are measuring the same thing, which you don't know. That's why effect sizes are unjustifiable unless they're unnecessary. And that's why people who research education know that 1 year's learning is 0.4 standard deviations. John Hattie says that teacher collective efficacy has an effect size of 1.6 standard deviations. That means that teacher collective efficacy would mean that students make 5 years progress every year. They'll be taking their HSC when they're 9. It's nonsense, because those effect sizes are not realistic effect sizes because they're obtained in laboratories or they're obtained from correlational studies rather than direct experiments. So effect sizes conceal more than they reveal. And they're basically a way of combining things that should not be combined, which is why I'm very critical about it. And indeed, most statisticians are. They don't use effect sizes in medicine. They just use like 5-year survival rates or days to discharge from hospital. They don't need to convert them into effect sizes because they're using the same measures in different experiments. As soon as you're using different measures, you have to prove that they're measuring the same thing, and you can't do that. You just don't know.
Next question. How do you capture formative assessment for reporting purposes?
I think the crucial thing is to reinterpret the evidence you've got for a summative purpose. So many teachers keep a mark book, which is great for reporting purposes, but lousy for planning teaching. I don't know of a single teacher who uses their mark book to decide what to actually teach next. Mark books are useful for reporting, so I think we should switch that round. Let's keep records on student achievement that tell us what they can do, and when it comes to report time, we will reinterpret that to produce a grade or a set of standard reports or whatever. But the important point is we take the evidence we collected for a formative purpose and we reinterpret it to come up with a summary judgment. That way, we can always go back to the original data. But knowing that a student is B on this and C on that tells me nothing. Knowing that the student has a sense of audience in their speaking tells me what I need to do to work with them. So that, I think, is the crucial thing. Let's start with records that help us teach and use those for summative reporting purposes rather than trying to reverse engineer meaningless summative grades into instructional objectives.
And they keep on coming.
Great.
How do you approach teachers who are reluctant to engage authentically in the process of observations?
Well, I've never had that problem because we start with the idea that it's the agenda of the person being observed. So, I mean, Karl Popper, the philosopher, once described his own schooling as a series of unwanted answers to unasked questions. And that's what I think a lot of school observation feels like. Somebody's coming into your classroom and telling you what they think you should be doing. The aim of professional development is not to make every teacher into a clone of every other teacher. It's to help each teacher become the best teacher they can be. And I think once they're past the initial years of their teaching practice, they are in a better position to say what they need to do to get better. We restrict the agenda to formative assessment to stop them doing things that have no research evidence, like learning styles or brain gym. But the idea is that within that menu of formative assessment, you choose, you're the professional. So with the really reluctant teachers, I start off with, could you be any better than you are right now? I've yet to hear a teacher say, well, having thought about it, I think I'm perfect in every conceivable respect. And if they say that, I say, does every student you teach get 100% on every test that you set? And no teacher is going to say yes to that because it doesn't happen. So you could be better. What would you like to get better at? And by making it their professional obligation, getting away from this idea of who's good and who's bad towards every teacher in this school is going to get better. Not because you're not good enough, but because you could be even better. If only the teachers we think are weak or struggling are going to be supported, we're not going to shift the needle. To make a difference in education at scale, we have to have every single teacher getting better, even if they're already the best teacher in the state. So we get rid of this stupid conversation about who's good and who's not so good towards let's all get better and let's support each other in getting better. I think that's the way to get those more reluctant veterans on board. We'd love to hear your experiences for the younger teachers. That's the way to co-opt them, I think.
Terrific. As a school, we surveyed students on our formative assessment techniques so far, and they were very positive about the impact on their learning. They want more and more consistency. Are there any large papers on student feedback on formative assessment that are published, or where would you point people, I guess, to go to learn more about what students are saying about the value of formative assessment for their own learning?
I don't think there's much, actually, and I don't think there's much systematic stuff. But it's also very, very idiosyncratic because the range of things that schools could choose to do under the heading of formative assessment is so wide that I'm not sure. People often ask me, where's the best place to start? And there isn't an answer to that question. It's different for different teachers, different subjects. But that's certainly something we should look to doing more systematically through the work in England.
Okay, 2 more questions at this stage. The research on quality teaching rounds shows 2 to 3 months of additional growth for students whose teachers have participated. It seems to take a different approach, addressing pedagogy broadly rather than specific strategies. It recognises the complexity of teaching, what teachers already know and do, and the importance of school and classroom contexts. How do you view the QTR approach in light of your own work?
Well, I think the answer is simple. In my work, I've chosen to make fewer assumptions about what teachers are trying to achieve, partly because I've been working in America where teachers feel really under constraint. So the idea of higher order thinking, they're saying, I haven't got time to do that. So it seems to me that the quality teaching approach is to try to work out what great teaching looks like at scale. But many teachers don't believe that they can teach in that way because of the system they're working in. So I've been focusing on a much more limited approach to say, what is it you can do in your school? So for example, you might be a behaviorist. You might believe in drill and practice. I still think you can do drill and practice better. So for me, it's just starting from what is it that every single teacher everywhere on the planet can engage in, just as a way of making it broader. So, I accept that's going to have a smaller impact per teacher, but it might have a bigger impact at scale because I'm not going to assume that you have to be buying into these things in order to engage in it. So I think that the quality teaching really is a quality approach, whereas mine's much more modest and just saying, what's the lowest common denominator we can get every teacher working on.
All right. Have we got time for 2 more? One's very quick. This one has just been added. Is visible learning the same as formative assessment? Are they 2 terms for the same thing? Quick answer?
Definitely not. So visible learning, John Hattie's idea that we should know thy impact is great. You can't do it. You can't know your impact. It's just impossible. Because actually, for most teachers, the impact they have isn't apparent for 2 or 3 years. Good teachers build foundations that make the teachers who teach their students in future years appear to be better than they really are because they lay such good foundations. Some teachers get great results this year. Some teachers get great results in 2 or 3 years' time when different teachers are teaching their students because they've built such positive attitudes towards learning and such sound foundations. So I think, first of all, the idea of know thy impact is just impossible. It's just too complex. And second, I think the whole methodology of meta-analysis of meta-analyses is statistical nonsense. And most statisticians agree with me. It doesn't make, those numbers don't make sense. And as a purely abstract exercise, that's fine. But when Corwin start calling these things influences on learning, I think that is completely wrong because they're correlations. They're not actually things that if you change, learning will get better. So I think that, I should say, I get on well with John. We've got a book coming out next week together. But I just think the visible learning stuff just takes people down the wrong road and produces ludicrously inflated expectations about the kind of impact you can have. If 1 year's learning is 0.4 standard deviations, as John himself says, then an effect size of 0.1 is huge.
Yes. All right, I don't want to end on a question about visible learning, so I'm
Yeah.
going to add one more. What do
Yes.
you have to say about the tension teachers face between getting through dense curriculum demands and meaningful learning that sticks for students?
Right, so I think it's pretty clear that you have about 18 months' work to cover every year in the Australian National Curriculum, and you have a choice. You can either deliver the curriculum as if you're a gas pump attendant. I'm going to deliver the curriculum. I'm going to make sure that every child gets exposed to this, and some will get it and some kids don't. I taught it, they just didn't learn it. In which case, do not do formative assessment. There's no point. You're not going to use the information. You're just going to plow ahead without taking any account of whether students are learning this or not. It's a logically consistent, but in my view, immoral position. If you go slower, you will take more of the students with you. But how do you cover the content? You can't. There's too much. And that's where your expertise in terms of subject knowledge becomes crucial. Not all content is equal. I used to love teaching phases of the moon. There's one way of teaching it with flashlights and tennis balls. But you know what? If students don't get it, nothing bad happens. There's nothing coming up in the next 3 years that depends on them getting this. The fact that matter is made of small particles, completely different story. In maths, place value, really important. Roman numerals, not quite so important. So you have to make a decision about this. And so Jerome Bruner gave us the answer 50 years ago. For anything in the curriculum, is knowing this as a child important to the adult? Do I need to do this? Is it important the child gets this? And is it important the child gets this now? If you can delay it, then do. And if you're worried about being criticized for not covering the whole curriculum, consign the bits you haven't done in class to homework. That way, if the child hasn't done it, you can blame the child, not you.
Well, on that note, what an absolute privilege to hear Dylan speak. I think for those of us who are coming back tomorrow, it's absolutely whet our appetites. And as a token of our thanks, Dylan, we have a bag of local goodies, which I'll just leave here. But we also have an artwork from an Indigenous staff member, I believe, from the Wallatuka Institute at the University of Newcastle. We hope you can find room in your luggage and a space in your home for
yes.
this lovely piece of art. So can everyone join me in thanking Dylan very much? Do you want me to just leave it here or take it with me down the steps?
Take it out, yeah.